John Bolton was a stupid guy, and he was a guy with no heart. And I fired him, and I didn't think it was a big deal. And I wasn't around him very much. But what he did do is he took classified information and he published it during a presidency. It's not, it's one thing to write a book after, during. And I believe that he's a criminal. And I believe, frankly, he should go to jail for that.
Welcome back. That was President Trump continuing his attack on his former National Security Advisor John Bolton as Bolton continues to attack him on his book tour. Bolton said this week that working in the Trump White House is, quote, like living inside a pinball machine. Called President Trump stunningly uninformed and said his sole motivation is re-election. As we've said, Bolton is now the fourth former top administration official to question the president's fitness for office. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, and former Chief of Staff John Kelly have all gone public with warnings about the president's competency or character. Joining me now is former acting White House Chief of Staff, former OMB Director Mick Mulvaney. His tenure at the White House overlapped quite a bit with John Bolton's time as National Security Advisor. They had the competing offices in the West Wing, two of the few with a fireplace in them, if I'm not mistaken. Mr. Mulvaney, thank you for coming on. Good to see you, sir.
Chuck, it's good to see you again. How have you been?
Oh, locked up, like the rest of us here a little bit. Let me start quickly. I want to get to the Bolton book, but I want to start with the virus. You were chief of staff basically in the early days of this, of the start of this pandemic. You look back on some things that you wish you'd have done sooner. You wish the administration would. Have you done your own after action report and feel as if there are some things you would have done differently now?
Chuck, it's easy to sort of look back and say, would you do things differently? Because the information was changing so rapidly. Keep in mind, early on, the only metric really had, the only measuring stick was the previous coronaviruses we had dealt with in the recent past, which were SARS and MERS. These were very, very deadly diseases, much deadlier, by the way, a higher fatality rate than coronavirus. But they weren't nearly as contagious. But we didn't know that at the time. And what we thought was if we can keep coronavirus, COVID, out of the United States, we could really prevent serious difficulties here. So we focused mostly on what they call containment. And it wasn't until the virus got to Italy that we learned more about how easy it was to move the virus, to contract the virus. And that's when we knew we had difficulties with containment and had to switch to mitigation. Now, fast forward, here we are, 3-4 months into it, and the CDC is telling us now that it's not as easy to get the disease, for example, from hard surfaces. It's not as easy to get it from somebody who's asymptomatic. So the information is changing. So yeah, it's easy to look back and say, yeah, we would do something different if we knew then what we know now. But given what we had at the time, I thought we did a really, really good job on trying to contain it, and then after we could, trying to mitigate it.
You look at our curve and the EU's curve, it's hard to sit there and say it looks like we've done a good job.
Look, we don't have the same type of culture we have. We don't have the same type of society they have. You've got 50. Keep in mind, public health in this nation is driven by the states. We don't have a sort of a national public health system. We do, but it's administered and run by the states, which is why you're seeing so many different policies across the 50 states. That's part of the way we are structured. So you're going to get a different result here than you would, say, in China, which has an authoritarian approach, or even in some European countries that have a more centralized approach. Look, am I happy with the number of people who have the disease? Absolutely not. Do I think we're doing a better job? Keep in mind, we look so closely, Chuck, at the numbers of people who are infected, when really that's not the critical metric. The critical metric is, do we have enough healthcare capacity to deal with the folks who need to go to the hospital? Because it looks like if you get this disease but get decent health care, the fatality rates go down dramatically. The places where we've had difficulty, the places where there's been difficulties all over the world, is when there's too many people getting it at one time to where they overwhelm the healthcare system and they can't get that care they need. In that case, the fatality rates go up dramatically. But look, it's a very dynamic situation. Everybody hopes that we can do better, wishes we can do better, is working to do better. But I don't think it's fair to look back and say, oh, you made this mistake, you made that mistake, just because the information changes so rapidly.
Let me move to the Bolton book. You made an interesting comment last week when you said if there was one criticism of the president you thought was valid, is that he didn't hire very well. Well, it struck me as sort of like I thought that was his chief pitch as a candidate. I want to play a bit of sound bites from the president and as a candidate talking about his hiring process. Take a listen.
I know the best people. We're going to get the best people. I know guys that are so good. Look, I have the best people in the world. The best people. The best people in every profession. We have to get the best people. We need to get the best and the finest, and if we don't, we'll be in trouble for a long period of time.
Look, I can go through the statistics here. 4 chiefs of staff, 3 secretaries of defense, 4 national security advisors. Why is the hiring process with this president so difficult?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, Barack Obama had 4 chiefs of staff in his first term as well. The average life expectancy of a chief of staff is not that long, especially in a first term. I think he had 1 in his second term, but it's a tough job. But anyway, that's not your question. Look, I think if you look back at those comments the president made when he was running for office, I think what the president didn't know was Washington, D.C. And hiring good business people is one thing. People in Washington, D.C. are different, and he learned the hard way with John Bolton. I think I give President credit for this. He was not afraid to hire people that he knew would disagree with him. It's one of the reasons he hired me to run the Office of Management and Budget, because he knew I was more fiscally conservative than he was. He welcomed that. He welcomed that difference of opinion. Where I think he made a mistake was not realizing that Washington, D.C. is full of people who aren't really interested in engaging in a debate. They're interested in just sort of winning an argument. And that's where John Bolton was. We had a lot of folks who had different opinions than the president. They would go in the Oval Office, they'd make their case, and the president would make the ultimate decision. And then almost all of us would line up and say, okay, I've had my say. I participated in the debate. I will now be able to go forward and in good conscience support what the president has decided. Except Bolton. Bolton was never willing to accept that, still isn't. He's still continuing to undermine the president today because he doesn't like the president's policies. He wants to be more militarily aggressive. He'd love to be at war with Iran, I think. Mm-hmm. I think he'd like to have military intervention in Venezuela, maybe in Korea. The president doesn't want any of those things. And instead of going along with the president after having his say, Bolton continued to try and undermine him. And I think that's the big difference. And that's what I mean when I say he hired.
When did you know that Bolton was a bad fit?
Before I was chief of staff. I think Bolton got there in April of 19. I was the chief of staff effectively December of 19. John was tough to work with. Sarah Huckabee Sanders' book is out. She details some things accurately that said he was tough to work with. He really was. He thought, and many times, Chuck, that he was the Secretary of State, and at times he thought he was the president. And it's just tough. That was the joke in the building, was that, President Bolton. That's what a lot of folks referred to him as. He was tough to work with. He really was. Now, again, that's not a problem as long as at the end of the day you're willing to sort of rally around the president's decisions. But John could never do that. His ego was too big to follow the president down any road that John Bolton would not have gone down if he were president.
In fairness, you've been around this town a long time. The book on John Bolton was out. John Bolton was a guy whose views were well known. He's a process guy. And it seems to me the most generous thing I could say about the disagreements between, I think, you and Bolton are this. He seems to be a process guy to the T. Dot every I, cross every T. And the Trump White House doesn't do that. And how much of it was that, do you think, the breakdown with the relationship between the president and Mr. Bolton?
Yeah, in fact, I would disagree with that entirely. John was a John process guy. Whatever he would do, what he wanted to do, he would not participate in the broader process. I think that's a major criticism of his. But look, I wasn't involved in his hiring. I was surprised when he was hired. I'm not an interventionist neoconservative like he is. I was surprised by the hiring. But again, the president, give him credit, has always welcomed people, in fact, encouraged people who disagree with him to join the team. So it was Bolton who was not able to conform his behavior to be a good part of that team, not the president's hiring.
We've never seen a sitting president have a former Secretary of Defense, a former Chief of Staff, a former National Security Advisor, and a former Secretary of State question their fitness for office. It's a big hurdle to go into re-election with, is it not?
Oh, I think it's much more an inside the beltway kind of discussion. I don't think most voters really care what Secretary Tillerson thinks about the president, or honestly, quite honestly, vice versa. We pay a lot of attention to it because we're from Washington, D.C., or you're from Washington, D.C. I'm back home in South Carolina, thankfully. But it makes for a good news story for a couple of days, something interesting. But I don't think it drives an election one way or the other. Nor should it.
Curious, are you done with elective politics?
Yes.
No, you're not running again? You're done?
No, I'm too short to be president, and I'm not interested in being governor of South Carolina. So I'm looking forward to going back to the private sector, in Washington every now and then, but mostly back in South Carolina.
All right, Mick Mulvaney, I'm going to leave it there. I appreciate you coming on, sharing the campaign's perspective here and your perspective on Mr. Bolton. Good to catch up, and hope to have you on again, sir.
Thanks, Chuck.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.